Leadership is not just about how to be a leader in a particular role, like how to do this, how to use the skills in a particular role, but really about how to be effective while in a role that requires you to work with other people, whether that's people who are direct reports, people who work laterally as colleagues. And so I think consistency could be a dangerous myth to play with. Dangerous in the sense that if somehow we're holding it as the gold standard for being a good leader, or gold standard for being a good family member, or gold standard to be a good community person, I think that the consistency comes from the values we hold.
Do you have any other like speaking gigs coming up?
Yeah, I have not open to the public, but I have a conference coming up in April for another organization, and I don't really do a lot for like for the public. I'm usually contracted by organizations.
One of my mentors like wants me to book him speaking gigs in like the healthcare space. He used to like direct be a hospital director for a number of years, and so I was curious like how you go about booking, but it sounds like some of the stuff is like booked for you.
Yeah, I actually work with other corporations, or they contact me and ask me to come and be a keynote or whatever. But yeah, I don't. I changed my business model. You and I may have talked about this a little bit last time, but I kind of changed my business model. So I wasn't out there looking for opportunities. I created the kind of engagement that opportunities would come to me if they're appropriate.
I was thinking you and I should start a hitman agency titled Hope and Lovejoy.
Hitman agency, yes. It would kind of
No
catch
one will
them
see
off
it
guard. They
coming.
wouldn't know. Yeah, they were like, that sounds way too positive to be something that
Exactly.
dark and sinister.
I mean, even just like Lovejoy itself, I get feedback that it's like unusually positive. So like hope, Lovejoy seems suspect.
I wonder, and we can talk about this on the podcast if you want, but do you feel like you have to live up to your name in some way? Is there some kind of
Oh yeah,
subconscious? Yeah.
yep, for sure. How about you?
Interesting. I do. I People already say this about me, so and I don't know if I'm not sure it's like a chicken and the egg kind of thing, right? Part of it is it because people are expecting it, or because that's how I was brought up? And I think it's a combination. The more people want it, the more I'm like, oh yeah, this is kind of who I am anyway. So
That is interesting, right? Because we didn't choose our names usually anyway, and therefore could we not choose anything? If we're choosing to live by someone else's expectations or rules, by that rationale, why stop there? What do you
yeah,
think?
I think we get to choose the rules that we decide to live by. I think more and more, as the older I get, the more I have let go of some of the rules that I made up, or the rules that I thought were rules, but I'm like, that's not actually a rule. No one said you had to do it this way. So, not just questioning just for the sake of like bucking the system, but just noticing what fits and what doesn't fit anymore. So, I'm much more free to do that these days than I have been, I think, in my past.
And what led to that freedom?
I think some age and perspective, wisdom, right, that comes with it. I did a lot of things growing up that exposed me to a lot of the world, and did a lot of travel, and so I think that also opened me up a bit. You know, growing up and like through high school, this was the way our family did things, right? And then went to college,
Right.
and it's like, oh wait, there's a lot of other ways to do things, and I think this is something that's more interesting to me. And now in the travel I did after that also helped me expose, more to like what the world and globally what that could look like, and I could see where I fit and where I didn't. And I think now, like, even just a small example is I always valued kind of like the intellectual exchange, and very conversations about some sort of strategy or some sort of book, and I was not necessarily trained or modeled how to connect with emotion as effectively. But as I've worked with people now, I see the value, and it's not even just value, it's crucial to be able to adapt and connect to people's emotions. So it's almost like I learned to speak a whole different language as I've grown older, because I value things that I didn't think was so important before.
You mentioned noticing that you didn't fit in certain areas. Is there anywhere that you didn't fit in initially that you do fit in now?
I didn't fit in initially. Well, this is a small example, but I remember I was in an organization called Up With People for 5 years right out of college, and is a performing arts community service organization. We traveled internationally, lived with host families, and performed a musical. And I was part of the staff, but I did get an opportunity to perform, and I'd been involved. I'd taken piano, and I did, music was part of my life too growing up. But the theater world was different. Right? A lot of the people who came that were in more of the theater track, um, very emotionally expressive. I remember we would host all sorts of activities as a staff. And some of those activities would move people to tears. Well, when I was growing up, crying was not a sign of strength and courage. It was a sign of weakness and immaturity, right? And so, um, growing up with that narrative, I always found myself, it was very I was resentful when we did activities that would lead people to cry, because I'm like, it feels like it's being manipulated, or I had all sorts of judgments about it, anyways. I sometimes would inevitably find myself crying too, or moved by whatever was happening, but I always resented that. It felt like I was made to cry, right? Um, and interestingly, now you flip it. I'm the person that meets a stranger, and this happened many, many times. Meets a stranger, and just by engaging in a conversation, asking a question, they end up crying because of something I asked or something I said, reflected back to them, where they're moved to tears. And it's become like a joke in my family. They're like, oh my gosh, Valerie, you made somebody else cry at Thanksgiving. But not cry out of frustration, just cry out of some sense of nostalgia. They were moved. So, when I was in my 20s, you would have never, ever, ever, ever heard me ever honor that tears were like a healing or a cleansing of sorts, where I do that now and create that kind of space. Not intentionally, but with purpose.
That's interesting to hear. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of emotions mixed up in crying. Like it could be joy, it could be like almost relaxation. Like you work so hard towards something, you see some people win an award or like a sports team, and it's like we don't see the sacrifice they made for a year, well, years really, and the support they had from their families, this and that, the team coming together, overcoming numerous hardships, and then they get some validation for that, some milestone, and it's moving. I don't know that I could wrap it up in a single word. It certainly wouldn't be sadness though.
No, no. So I think, well, I don't say crying necessarily out of grief, right? But like you said, it could be relief. It could be a deep sense of satisfaction or fulfillment, and that there is no words. And I know as a coach, and is not exclusive to a gender, right? So it could be anybody that when they've touched, because I don't think I do anything other than create the safety for it, a container where it's okay. If you want to cry, it's fine, right? But I don't ever have to say that. But it's just generally in my question or whatever, they will say something or do something that has causes them to reflect, and oh wow, I didn't think this would still bother me. And I mean, stuff like that comes up often, or I didn't realize that that was so important to me. And um, I just, I'm blessed, I think, honored that I have been able to expand myself. It's kind of cool to be able to see, wow, I've become even more whole, a human being now, right? Not just limited to here's how I grew up, and I'm just not that way. I usually look at those statements with some suspicion, like, what is it that I'm not this way? What does that mean? Is that something I'm resisting? Is it something that I'm being closed minded to, or right? So I'm learning to flow a little bit more, David.
That's good. We should all learn to flow a little bit more. Speaking of acting and crying, I spoke to an actor turned therapist who knows a thing or two about character development. And he mentioned how basically anger is a cover emotion towards like sadness, or crying would be underneath that. So I'm curious about your thoughts. And if that is true, to the extent that it is true, why do you think anger is seen as more of a strong, mature emotion and crying is seen as a more immature emotion, when by that rationale, it's actually the more honest and accurate emotion.
I can't speak for other people's experiences just because I think we all have kind of our own personal journey, and so much has to do with the nature versus nurture, right? But I will tell you, for me, anger didn't seem like a mature response to things either. So, case in point, I grew up in a family where my dad was in the military for 27 years, so he was definitely high achiever, very disciplined, responsible person. My mom was a school teacher, also high achieving, very responsible, right, filled with logic in this family. And I'm the only girl. I have three brothers. And so in my household, first of all, whenever sometimes I would cry because I was so frustrated that I didn't know how to put it into words, and it would just come out as tears. But it was, generally a message like, don't cry, stop crying, why are you crying, right? So I slowly, as I got older, I learned to just turn that off, just kind of dull, turn down the volume on that. But sometimes I would see that my father would erupt in anger and would raise his voice, and he was never violent with us, but his voice felt violent to me. And most of the time I didn't necessarily see it as a rational reaction to what was happening, or something small. Hey, okay, so we forgot to wash the dishes, or somebody didn't do the chore or whatever. And I had a lot of judgment about how he expressed anger through his voice. And so I learned to repress anger because I'm like, I think it's rude. I don't think it helps. I think it's, creates more problems than it solves. And so I'll tell you that during the pandemic, I started, my work, a lot of it has to do with, sitting in this little corner of my office coaching people. And I was starting to have a lot of back pain, just like really, really uncomfortable, kind of achy, kind of sciatic like achiness, right? And I did all the things. I would get up and stretch every hour, and I make sure I had all the liquids, and I would do some yoga. I even eventually went to a massage therapist, and I had a whole series of sessions with that person, just working all this stuff out. And maybe like the second to last session, he said, Valerie, I noticed that you come, you do your stretches, we do this the manipulation, the chiropractic or whatever, and sometimes it comes back after a few days, sometimes it comes back a few hours. He's like, so is it possible that this is not actually a physical issue? Could it be emotional or mental? And I was like, oh. So he recommended a book by this gentleman, Dr. John Sarno. I think that's the name, Dr. John Sarno. That's called Mind Body Connection, I believe it's called. And and so when I read it, it talked about back pain being a manifestation of repressed anger, and I was like, what? That coupled with a few other things that I had read, did some shadow work, right? When you kind of look at things that we repress in our subconscious, for example. I started conversations with my family, and I'm like, do I ever get angry? Would you say that I ever express anger to you? And most of my friends and family were like, not really. I mean, you get frustrated, but I don't think. And at 50 or 49 at the time, I'm like, no anger, like none of my closest friends and family. That's weird, right? That's like uncommon. And so, and no, notwithstanding that my name is Hope, so it doesn't feel like I should have any anger issues about anything. But I knew that, oh, that's not healthy. So if I'm repressing it, and I realized that, oh, in fact, I had some judgment about anger and how it was being expressed when I was growing up. And so that meant that I just
Yeah.
couldn't. Long story short, I actually did some of the mental and emotional work, to talk to a coach about it. And then I went out on a rampage, looking at, not rampage of like yelling at folks, but I would start looking at the places where I was dissatisfied or upset or frustrated, and I hadn't said anything. And so I reached out to my brother, I reached out to my boyfriend, my mom, I think my dad. So I just kind of like, hey, you know what? This thing that happened, I was really upset about that. I don't think I ever told you how upset it made me, or how irritated, or how angry, or whatever. Um, and the back pain disappeared.
How did it go over with the other person? Were they receptive to that?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So like in the case of my brother, who we all grew up in that kind of household, he was like, yeah, that makes sense, that tracks. That we never talked about it, or it was never expressed that way. Because I told him about some things I'd resented about our relationship when we were kids, and like, how come you never stood up for me when this happened? Da, da, da. And he's like, yeah, I get it. But it was a very peaceful, loving, kind, hey, I'm sorry. And I said, I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier and I was holding this against you. I didn't realize, right? And then it happened with some stranger that was just kind of getting on my nerves, and I was annoyed, and I didn't know what to say in the moment. I just couldn't without ruining the vibe of everybody in the place. So when I got in my car after that event, I yelled out loud to myself just how annoyed this person made me, and just and I said all the things, and the pain went away.
It's interesting. People are more perceptive than I think we give them credit for, but sometimes they themselves are kind of being polite. So they're not commenting on what they're observing. So it can actually be conducive to a better business dealing or relationship if you just call it out, I think, because then you get closer to honesty faster. And it's interesting that when you come to the realization that there is a healthy expression of anger, but if you start with a position where it doesn't seem that way, it does make sense that you would map that to the no-go zone. Um, you are a public speaker and a leadership coach at the Berkeley Executive Coach, so Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute.
Yeah, so I received my certification through the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute, and I serve as a contracted faculty coach.
Could you talk about how you became a leadership coach?
Well, I think if you had like the real origin story, it would go back to when I was maybe 16 years old, and my band director, Mr. Bolish, called me out for being a teacher and coach. He's like, you spend time with the students in band, helping, the color guard, helping them with their speed spins or encouraging them. And I knew that I did that instinctively, but I had never heard it called something like coaching or teaching. And so I think I always had that drive, or intuitively always sought out opportunities to help people become better at something or feel better about something. But then professionally, I think when I started working, I was working with Hyatt Hotels actually for some time, and I was doing so in a training capacity. I often found myself, as people are learning new things, right, and they're either struggling or not really open to it or challenged by it, having a coaching style conversation about them. So it was kind of a subtle way of using coaching, and it became more intentional when in my eventually in my role in Hyatt, I became a regional director of learning, and we were actually taught to coach more intentionally by asking certain types of questions or following a particular framework. And I thought coaching at the beginning was boring. I'm like, it just takes too long. We have to talk one on one and ask questions. Can we just tell people the answer? Can we just get to the meat? And but I realized that if I really wanted to help people learn, that was the bridge that I was supposed to support them to cross, is by asking them questions to reflect. Otherwise, I would be doing all the fishing and finding myself overwhelmed and exhausted. So that's how kind of the progression through now having my own business and really focusing on leadership coaching and speaking came about.
So you've been consistent,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the
starting at
ikigai. I
16.
got the ikigai.
Yeah, right. That's
Yeah.
great. And then you are based in
Dallas, Texas.
Dallas, is that
Yes.
right? And then you are working at UC Berkeley's Executive Coaching Institute. Is that like a hybrid?
It's one of my clients, right? So Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute provided the certification. They would the certification program that I participated in, and because they also are hired by organizations to do either workshops or different coaching experience coaching programs. I am one of the coaches that they call to work with some of these clients as well, right? So I'm working through Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. Then I have other organizations that I also work with as a contractor. They bring me in to do coaching or bring me in to facilitate that sort of thing. So,
How would you identify your coaching clients? Are they all in the same bucket or are they in a few buckets?
which buckets are you referring to?
Well, what exactly are you coaching them on?
in general, the topic, I would say, when we say leadership, is not just about how to be a leader in a particular role, like how to do this, how to use the skills in a particular role, but really about how to be effective while in a role that requires you to work with other people, whether that's people who are direct reports, people who work laterally as colleagues, or even managing, leading upward in your supervisor. Oftentimes the topics are around how to communicate more effectively with people, how to create and define and clarify goals or objectives in a way that are actually beneficial, actionable. It could also be how to manage oneself. I mean, I'm finding a lot of times talking about how to manage someone's temper or patience or lack thereof, how to manage someone wanting to please and say yes to everything and feeling overwhelmed, someone perhaps feeling burned out and uninspired by the work they do. So my job is always to kind of figure out what the outcome is, help them identify that, but then usually the root that we work on is them, their own, being able to be to be conscious of themselves and understand why they're reacting the way they're reacting, so that they can find more effective ways.
And these clients are like business leaders or like an entire business organization. Is it how does it how are you matched with these folks?
Yeah, typically the work that I do, the corporations that hire us or any of the companies that I work with usually have mid-level managers, directors, VPs, et cetera. That's kind of the range of role. And then as far as the types of organizations, I mean, I've worked in every type of organization, from technology to healthcare to education, so all sorts of industries represented too.
So mid-level leadership, industry agnostic. Have you noticed a difference depending on the industry to how receptive they are to your coaching style, or have you had to like change kind of the delivery?
There's some things, I think there might be some very subtle things from industry to industry. Um, Ironically, I think of, like, for example, in education, I tend to note that creating change is often dependent on the system and the environment in which this education. So if it's a district, or if it's a charter school, or there's usually some other entity that's actually kind of charged with the change, right? So I sometimes notice, I might be mistaken, but I sometimes notice not necessarily resistance, but kind of like, that's how things are done here because that's the system in which we have to work. That kind of mentality, right?
Right.
Um, in technology, which tends to be more innovative and more looking forward toward the future, where there might be tons of changes coming very quickly, especially in the processes, systems, and the technological side. Ironically, it's the technology moves faster than the human in the evolution, right? So we
Yeah.
work more on getting to the 5.0 version of something for some external outcome, not necessarily on who do I need to be in order to be a match or in alignment with the way that this organization is progressing. So there's a little bit more an individual responsibility, I think, in those types of organizations, uh, where maybe the systems are more focused on the product and the output than the person that's actually involved in the production. So I always tell people, kind of like the Stephen the oh my gosh, Stephen Covey talks a lot about production versus production capability, right? And so my job is to help leaders understand what's the production capability that you can focus on in order for you to be able to produce. And so in any industry, that's always true.
Yeah.
The responsibility sometimes depends on the way the organization is kind of set up.
And I imagine you walk the walk. So what's the production capability in your line of work with leadership coaching?
Man, David. So part of it is I do meditate. I could definitely step it up and do it more regularly, but that's something that I've always found very helpful. But I also do some of these exercises. I'm certified also in Psych K, which is essentially a system that supports in reprogramming or looking at our subconscious thoughts and beliefs that get in the way of being more effective in the world. And so I use some of the techniques that I learned in my certification with myself so that I'm able to just kind of challenge some of the thoughts, behaviors that I have. I'm always taking classes too. I've always found that learning is a
Yeah.
big way. I just signed up for an improv class
Nice.
recently. So to keep me on my toes in my facilitation, make me a
Yeah.
better listener.
Yes, and
Yes, I am.
yeah. When does that start?
It started on Sunday, just so a few days ago. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm on level two
Where can we watch it live?
now. No, there's no live. There's no SNL version of this. This is a very
Not yet.
personal journey for me.
Oh, good for you.
Thanks.
I was too scared to do that. Maybe I will
Really?
someday.
You don't seem
Actually,
like
well, I
that.
took a somewhat of a leadership class, but it was more like there's only like 6 people. The coach was an improv like pro, and or he did like impro theater, which is a little bit different. I understand, but anyway, it taught us about the yes and how we speak, and there's different like vocal exercises we did, such as speaking on the intake breath rather than is that or is it outside? I forget which one. Do you recall? It's like one gives you more like it makes you come across a little bit more positive, whereas the other one makes you come across like a little bit nervous.
I think speaking on the out breath probably sounds more positive
Outside.
or more
Okay.
confident. And speaking on the
Right after I said that, I
intake,
started to second
I'm
guess.
trying to do
So
it right now.
maybe that's I mapped it the wrong way. That's what I did wrong. This is how you do it right. Well, look it up. But stuff like that, obviously, I probably do for another class.
What did you
Now you,
go ahead? I
sorry,
was just
go
going
ahead.
to ask you how did that class impact you or how you work or lead?
Was the first I guess you call it like they call it a residency. It was an 8-day intensive class with the MBA program during the pandemic, so it's remote. And one of the modules we had a guest speaker. It was really good, and he taught us about looking in the camera and a couple other like tricks you can do for remote conferences or calls to make it a little bit more personal, and which for us was really useful because we weren't yet used to. If you recall, this is like 2020, 2021. We weren't really used to talking into a camera lens for so long. And he at the end he gave a little pitch. If you like to work on some of these skills, I'm starting this class. I'll give you a good deal or whatever. And figured why not? And it was really fun. It was kind of like a fireside chat with like a campfire with like a small group of people, both the instructor and his assistant, and then I think like 5 or 6 of my classmates. And it was really good. It was I think 4 or 6 classes, maybe every other week or something like that. But this was a few years back. Sadly, I didn't keep up with my practice, but I do remember looking at the camera. That was one thing. And yeah, I forgot the breath thing. And there's some other like vocal exercise they did to kind of like loosen the diaphragm or loosen the vocal cords. That were kind of fun, like silly stuff you do to just like shake and get the nervous energy out of your muscles or whatever. Have you done any stuff like that in your class?
I've done some. It's funny because at Berkeley, we actually also have quite a few people who come from a theater background, including the founder. And so, oftentimes, when we teach communication exercises and things like that, they often have a similarity, if not come straight, they're ripped off the pages of some playbook for theater. So, yeah, it's fun. It's fun. And it does kind of shake up the work we do, especially in corporate settings where sometimes
Yeah,
that kind of play, right, being playful or being a dramatic doesn't always is not always encouraged. So I think it brings a different dynamic to the group.
yeah. How long is your class?
Depends on what we're doing, right? Sometimes we do workshops that last several days, right? And maybe we split it up. And other times it could be just a full day, or sometimes it's just a few hours.
Okay. And is it like 3 months or 12 sessions or something like that?
So it depends on what it is. So the courses that we've done, for example, with organizations that bring us in, like there have been programs that go over several months. So let's say there's a couple of programs right now that I'm involved in through Berkeley where we have 6 months long, right? Where we've done three workshops, two in person, one virtual, and then over those 6 months, I had a group of 6 individuals that I was coaching one on one, and we do that virtually in between all these workshops. And so that program lasts like a
That's
six
cool.
month period. Others go the whole year. So it kind of depends on the
Yeah.
organization and the contract that they signed with the company.
I think that's a great idea. Like teaching while you're learning, because that really reinforces it, right?
That's one of the reasons that I became a coach, really, because I was just like, oh, this is the only real way for people to learn. And, you get the sugar high of a workshop, and you're like, oh, that's so interesting. Oh, that was so cool. And you do the
Yeah.
things, and then all of a sudden, you go back to work as usual, and you forget, and you don't even know how to apply it.
You mentioned charter schools earlier. What do you think about kids teaching other kids, like as they're learning, like the sixth graders teaching the fifth graders or something like that?
I'm not sure about the system, but my older brother teaches at a Montessori school, and I have a very close friend who's also was a former Montessori school director, and I love that system. I love the idea of having autonomous learning with some guidance. I think I wish I think I was like in my heart and a Montessori kid, a Montessori student in my heart. Um,
Yeah. Well, I think we
I
all
know,
were.
right? But
I think that's the
I
point. Yeah.
do think it's important, again, so that we're not just giving fish, that we're teaching people to fish.
Yeah.
And I believe that the Montessori program has done that. I'm sure there are other schools and other models that do it, but that's the one that I know that I have familiarity with.
Yeah, that's great. And for those who aren't aware, that's a charter school. Is it US only or is it worldwide?
No, it's international. International, started by Dr. Maria Montessori from Italy, and essentially is a system that is they use a lot the Socratic method a lot. It's primarily seen, I think, in the States, primarily seen in primary education. There might be a few high schools, and then right, the idea then is to have the students really drive their learning, and they're given options, but they're also taught other things like being responsible for cleaning up after themselves, taking care of one another. I've really been so impressed with anything that I hear about Montessori and the small experiences that I've had with them.
So you have done a couple of podcasts and not just dabbled. You have one with over 100 episodes, which is a significant milestone for those who aren't aware, and one with like over 70 or 80 episodes as well. So these are significant endeavors. What led to you, A, doing a podcast, but more interestingly to me, perhaps, what made you go that far and then say, actually, I'm going to start another one and then stop? Can you walk me through, like, what did you learn? What was that experience like?
So why I started initially, the first one, I'd gone to a conference, like a 4-day conference, and one of the things they told us is you should have a social media presence. So I'm just starting my business, and I thought, okay, that makes sense. What would I talk about? So I tried doing like, hey, grab your phone and record a message, and I did that once, and
Yeah.
I was just like, now what? Do I have to do this every day? That was weird. And I remember having a conversation with my brother, and he was like, "Well, you follow a couple of people whose podcast you might want to model." And one of those people was actually Marianne Williamson, who's a candidate for president right now. But she has what she calls a live stream where she would give a lecture about some topic and then go into the audience and interact. And so my first podcast kind of started that way. I would just say, here's a topic, and invite people to come on Zoom and have a conversation with me about the topic, or I would kind of coach them on the spot. And eventually that kind of morphed into me inviting a special guest, having a meaningful conversation, and so on. And then the second podcast, similarly, I thought, not just about social presence. It was more now that I wanted to support all the things that were coming to light around connecting with other people. And it's called Not Quite Strangers. And this one was a direct inspiration from everything that was happening after George Floyd was murdered, and the resurgence of interest in building diverse and diversity, equity, and inclusive spaces, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. And so I knew that my contribution had to be more on the human to human level, and but I wanted to make sure that it was expansive, that other people could benefit from it. So the podcast was kind of like a no-brainer, like, oh, I'll talk to more people and show and tell what it's like to connect with strangers and people from different places. And that's kind of how it happened. And I stopped because I just got bored. Not bored. I was just like, okay,
Ran its
I'm
course.
done. I think it's time for something new. And the moment I start noticing that there's any kind of dissatisfaction, or there's this kind of, oh, well, I know that that's a big tell for me to question whether or not it's either do it differently or just stop.
So you reserve the right to go back and start again. Like it's fine to have a hiatus if it comes to that. And it's fine to have just a volume of work like an author that's written a few books and is on to other things. Is that kind of how you look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. We all do. About anything.
Yeah. So do you have any ideas for like podcasts you might do in the future? Or do you think I'm not even thinking about that right now?
Yeah, I don't know. I have been tempted though, David, and I think when you and I had our first conversation, I was tempted to like, man, this was so fun. I really do enjoy like meeting new people in this kind of format, and I could probably do a few more episodes. In fact, because Not Quite Strangers was about introducing two people who did know each other and having a meaningful conversation, I actually thought, oh, it'd be so awesome to have like firefighter and a police officer and talk about how that first responder experiences, or I had like these moments. And then I thought about
Yeah.
all the logistics that I remember having to manage, and I'm like,
Yeah.
no, that's not it. So now I'm working on a book.
Oh, no way. Is it your
Yeah,
first one?
well, I've written a chapter in an anthology before, but this is my first full book. Yeah.
And how far in are you?
I have a lot of ideas and some random thoughts captured.
Brainstorming phase or emptying your pockets on the table, so to speak?
A bit, yeah, a bit of the emptying the pockets on the table phase. Working on putting together an outline, but I have, because I feel that sense of that momentum and that joy. Right, for me, if I know, okay, I can feel the joy, I can feel the alignment, and
Yeah.
when I have a lot of ideas, when I feel very prolific in the ways in which I can approach it, that tells me I'm on the right track. And so I'm already talking to publishers and talking to people who published books before, getting some of their best practices. But I'm ready.
Cool. Do you have like a date in mind that you want to have it published by or finished by, or are you just taking it as it comes?
I do have a date in mind, and because I don't have all the pieces together yet, I'm not going to announce a specific date yet, but I can tell you a lot of it has to do with what it means to meet new people and have meaningful relationships, because that's something that I get so much joy from. I see some people also would like to have that same joy but don't really know either how to do it or feel a little awkward or whatever. So I feel like there's something there that I can provide that comes so naturally for me. And that's my next thing.
Okay, cool. Do you have a title in mind?
I'm playing with, because my company name is Connect to Joy. I'm playing with something around connecting to joy with people, or connecting to joy in relationships, or connect something like that, connecting to joy with strangers. I'm not quite sure yet, but there's something in that vibe.
Maybe like something like love and joy.
Love and joy. Connect to love, joy, hope.
So, on that note, I have a spicy question for you.
Spice away.
You mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do you think there is a situation where that might go too far? Too much diversity, too much equity, or too much inclusion?
I think where it would go too far is if people are not holding it with the respect and honor that it requires, because they're not concepts in and of themselves. We're talking about humans, right? There's some humans that are involved that we now slap these different labels to kind of let us know the direction in which we want to manage this human, right? This human concern or this human goal or objective
Endeavor.
endeavor. Exactly. So I think that going too far is simply, we're not ready. If we're not ready to honor the level of relationships that it requires. I often tell I do some work with leadership, inclusion, leading with inclusion, right? Or leading as an inclusive, being an inclusive leader. And a lot of times is not enough to just check the boxes and do the things and the behaviors and the goals. Is you kind of have to, I hate to say it this way sometimes, but I'm like, you kind of have to love people enough to want that, right? And I will say that sometimes it doesn't matter if places are diverse and inclusive and driven by equity. Maybe not, right? So if we're talking about uh, a system of people who work in a homogenous context, right? Whether that's the you lived in Japan for some time, right? So if if it's important for that organization or that company or for that group of people to have perspectives from different countries and cultures, and that would enrich the quality of the product or the experience that they're hoping to create, then absolutely, then diversity matters, right? So they just have to be ready for it. How to, again, production capability versus production. So they're ready
Mm.
for it. Hey, my mindset is right, where I know this is going to be hard, or I know it's going to be different, or I know I need to kind of wrap my head around some different ways of doing things, then it could be really lovely. But if that's not what people are driving for, then to have inclusion and diversity and equity just because it looks good, I don't think honors the human.
I would agree. I think we have a tendency to categorize ones and zeros or paint with a broad brush people who maybe have a certain brand or a certain slogan. And I've found people like yourself that strike me as very loving, that champion DEI initiatives, and then I've seen people that don't strike me as quite loving that do the same. And I think you'd find that across any like religion or hierarchical system, etc. Um, and when we mentioned about like anger and then sadness, I think even deeper and more fundamental is love. And that's kind of the compass or litmus test that I have for the truth in something. If I can sense love in it, then I think that it's worth exploring, because I think the honest mm, response to a new situation should be one of curiosity rather than anger or defensiveness. I think if there's anger or defensiveness, that's caused for curiosity. Where is that coming from? Why, if I say, Valerie, I believe in this, and you're like, I don't, or could you explain why? And I get angry at that, then I might want to question where my belief lies. What about that angered me, etc. So yeah, I think I like what you said about like love kind of, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth now, but love being the North Star.
I think you are putting words in my mouth because your last name is Lovejoy. You kind of feel like you have a corner on that market. But no, but I agree 100%. I do think that love is at the core. Um, and that's the other thing I had to learn. In fact, we were not a family that said "I love you" growing up. It was kind of like implied, assumed, right? Like, of course we love each other. We do all.
Sound like you were born in Sparta. Where was
They
this? Was this
have
Texas?
no. I mean, we're immigrants from the Republic of Panama, so but that was just not our culture or family culture. That was just not it. And very masculine energy, I would say, kind of the driving the home. And not to blame it on that, they're very loving, masculine energy people, but it was just not. That was not something expressed. And it wasn't until like late in life where I actually I took some personal development courses that started to help me question, like, why was that, and what outcome or what impact did that not being able to express love that openly with my family have on me. And once I kind of figured out, like, oh, it's actually that's one of those rules like we talked about, right? It's a what That's not a rule. Like, no one actually said that we couldn't. But if I want to challenge the rule, I have to amp up my production capability, right? To get that up. I can't just judge my family for not doing it. You never told me you love me. You hardly ever say no. I'm like, okay, come on, can I say it? Could I do it? So I remember talking to my older brother about this, and I said, hey, you know what? We never said that to each other. Why? And so we kind of batted around some thoughts, and I was like, well, you know what? But I just want you to know how much I love you and appreciate you, and I don't ever tell you that. And it was a very moving conversation for both of us. And he reflected the same back to me. And I kind of went on a love tour with the Hope family. So I called my mom and my dad and my younger
Love tour
brothers.
with the Hope family. I love that.
Yeah, love tour with the Hopes. And it was basically just sharing that with each of them. And here's David, here's where the test came, because yeah, I was okay, family, cool, easy. But I remember hanging out with my brother and some friends. We were at this park. They were all men, the people I was hanging out with, and it was me, five or four of us. And we were just chit chatting, talking about stuff. And this group of young kids, males, kids, maybe 12, 13-year olds or so, right, middle school age, came by, walking by. And I remember one of them said, hey, he loves you, or something like that to me, directed to me, right? And in a moment in time in the past, I would have been like, how inappropriate, you don't just tell strangers you love them, like you reserve that for like very special relationships, I had
You yell
rules.
back, that's inappropriate.
Exactly, like rules where I would have just like shut down or been like, oh my gosh, these kids, they're crazy. And so they yelled this out, kind of, I knew they were like teasing somebody, right? And I just, without missing a beat, I was like, I love you too. And they start laughing. Ah. But then eventually, like within a couple of minutes, they come over and they start talking with us. And then we start hanging out. And it wasn't, anything huge or deep, but it was just like, hey, what are you guys doing out here? And I'll go, we're just running our bikes. We're going to go play basketball. Oh, cool. And it was such a loving exchange. And I'm like, how many kids grow up in an environment where they can be that expressive and not be laughed at or judged for it? Or how many adults allow themselves to do that in a way that doesn't creep anybody out or doesn't, right? But I knew, I'm like, I passed the test. I could love strangers and say I love you and mean it. So that was my big thing.
You mentioned creeping people out, and I think that's a fear that some people who are sensitive to other people's opinions of them, like repress their own actions and thoughts and words because they're afraid of being seen as wrong or as a creep, as you say, if it comes to like maybe expressing your feelings towards someone. I wonder if authenticity is the antithesis to creepiness. If you're authentic, do you think you can still come across as creepy, or do you think creepy is kind of a signal that maybe you're not being authentic?
Ooh, lovely question. My instinct to answer that would be, I think authenticity wins. But authenticity, here's the thing, authenticity coming from a place of love, not
Yeah.
authenticity from a place of fear. Because people often, I can also hear people that would say, well, I'm just saying I'm being authentic right now. And I just hate when this
Okay.
happens. I'm being real, right? So there's this, I think we conflate sometimes the reaction that we have. And I remember hearing a speaker say there's a difference, a distinction between truth and honesty. And the way she expressed it is Alison Armstrong, by the way, just to attribute the right person. So she talked about truth being a moment in time where you answer something as this is true right now, like, right? So someone saying, um, an example she gives is somebody that makes a commitment to be married to this person. You want to get married? Yes, that is true. It might change 5 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now when I say I want to get a divorce, right? Or I met somebody else, or whatever it is. It's not that 20 years ago I was being untruthful. Like I told the truth.
Right.
But honesty would be the difference is honesty is admitting here's some things that have changed in my life, in my perspective, in my experience, and being able to own the mistakes that we make, or being able to own that we've changed our minds about something, and share that openly. And so I think authenticity from the honesty, right, which is the loving, the higher self is the authentic part. And we, I think, don't always have the clarity to know which part of us is actually communicating the truth in the moment.
Brilliantly said. Yeah, that's a very good clarification. The other is almost like building a structure on top of another structure instead of like hard bedrock or something,
Yes.
where if you're not self-aware enough to know where a certain thought or feeling is coming from, that too could be like, yeah, it's true to that point, but it's untrue in that it's not really your core, like you mentioned, the foundation of love. So yeah, I think that's a really good distinction.
And I think that the tell I would add to this is the tell to know whether or not is being if we're being really authentic is there's a sense of peace within ourselves about what we're saying or doing in the moment, that is not trying to accomplish something. There's no manipulation or we're not strategizing to get some sort of response, or avoiding or holding back or anything. There's a sense of just, okay, this is what's experienced right now. There's a coherence. There's a coherence between the head and the heart.
And reserving the right to change your mind with new information you brought up, I think, is really important too. Some people wind up stuck in a business decision or a relationship because that's the way it was, and they don't want to be like, inconsistent. It's funny how we want to be consistent, which is ironic because we're not in a, nature is chaotic and changing all the time, and yet we're the ones that want to be consistent. So of course you have to find a balance there. Like, you don't want to change your mind every day, perhaps. I don't know, maybe you do, but what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. Oh, what are your thoughts? I'm going to ask you that first.
All right. Well, there we go. The roles have reversed here. Let me. I think what you mentioned about meditation is overlooked. I think journaling and meditation are essential, like drinking water. Now, to what extent, I don't know if that's a daily thing, if you need to do both, either, whatever. But you need, I think, to do more. I think all of us need to do more of that. And I think we need more perspectives. So having a trusted group of friends, mentors, people that you work with, and that can help uh, kind of test some of your theories and develop them. And you also contribute. There's this interesting one of my speech coaches. I only have one. I was thinking one of my mentors. One of my speech coach. She watched this movie called what was it called? Bliss, by the same director that did like Another Earth and I Origins. Kind of an interesting director. His movies have this like almost an emptiness to them, but really interesting questions at the same time. And in this movie, well, there's so many ways to take it. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but she asked me what my thoughts were. And one of the things I said to her was based on something else that I heard from another guest, which is we're only seeing ourselves in the world. Like everything we see around us basically maps information back to us. It's like echolocation. And yet we only exist in someone else's eyes, which is this really interesting kind of paradox, if you will, where it's all about others, but it's also all about ourselves and all about how much we love ourselves. And going back to what you mentioned about authenticity. So, in reserving the right to change your mind while being consistent or consistent enough, finding that balance, I think is takes more than yourself. But basically, maybe journaling, meditating, talking to others, and asking, does this feel like where on my level is this decision coming from? Is it from my core, like you mentioned, acceptance? Um, and I mean I don't know that I could succinctly say like a easy like always do this, but I think that for myself, for example, I've not changed my mind when I should have, or I changed it I think later than I should have for efficiency's sake and health sake, etc. And I think if I'm being honest, I probably changed it too fast in other instances. And I say that because I notice it in other people. And so if I notice it in other people, it's probably true for myself. But if I'm being honest with you, I haven't noticed that in myself very much. But that's something I do notice, that you can change it too quickly and you can change it not quickly enough. So I think we should have a little bit more, leave that as an option.
Yeah, and I think as you're saying that the leaving as an option, I think have to have some grace with ourselves because we are constantly evolving. In fact, I remember I think it's the is it the Field Museum in Chicago that I went to? I don't know. It was like a science museum. I can't remember if that's the name of the Field Museum or something. There's a science museum, and I remember they had a particular floor where you could stand in front of this scanner. This is years ago. I don't know if they still have this exhibit somewhere, but and the scanner would like there was some sort of beam that would just do this scan on you and it would tell the age of your organs. Like it was so cool. It was so cool. Like
This was accurate, or just for example, like was it real or?
I, the science museums, like I got a ticket to be accurate. There are all sorts of really cool things. Like you could sit in front of this computer and it would take an image of you and then project what it would look like when you were in your 60s and 70s, and it would take your photo and enhance. So there was some, I don't know, there was some
Does anyone
AI
just run out the building? Like,
it was I'm like,
I don't
oh, I
want to
look
see
like
that.
my mom. But what was interesting about this scan was as it was telling you like, okay, your kidney is how many days old, or your liver is how many weeks old. What I kind of it became clear to me, not that I've ever studied the human body the way a doctor would or a scientist would, but I realized that our bodies are constantly evolving. Every cell in our body replenishes, they die off, new ones are come up, and we kill them off, they reborn. All sorts of things are happening constantly. it only makes sense that our synapses, our brains also growing and learning. We're shedding things that we no longer need. And so I think consistency could be a dangerous myth to play with. Dangerous in the sense that if somehow we're holding it as the gold standard for being a good leader, or gold standard for being a good family member, or gold standard to be a good community person, I think that the consistency comes from the values we hold. If we can be consistent about the value, right? Consistent with the production capability versus consistent with the product, I think that's where we get a lot more, we can be more intentional, we can be more graceful with each other. Like, okay, you are clearly committed to, in your case, you're committed to having inspiring conversations with people, right? Your commitment to curiosity, your commitment to connection, all of those things, be consistent with that. How they're expressed might change depending on the technology that you have access to, depending on your mood, depending on the people that you connect with, right? So I say let's be consistent. At least that's what I'm committing to myself, is to be consistent in my value, my the human values that I hold true.
Well said. That makes a lot of sense. Because I was wondering how to square the circle from cultural preservation, like keeping cultures alive and traditions and stuff like that. I've heard a saying or something, I don't know who to attribute it to, that traditions are experiments that worked. And I don't know to what extent that may or may not be true. But then sometimes, like you mentioned, the temporal component, maybe that time has long since passed, and maybe the Hope family is ready for someone to start expressing love, and and maybe without judgment, because probably there was some reason for the adaptation that got you here. And so when you look at like the big picture, the Hope family is full of love because it got you
Yeah.
here, and then you're sharing that. So it's really interesting when you start to look at these different layers and the way that things are connected. So I'd like to finish
May
with
I add?
public
May I just
speaking.
add one thing to
Yeah, please, please. Yeah,
the way we now always say "I love you" to each other? Any phone call we end with "I love you," all of us,
even your
even my
dad.
dad, my mom, my dad, my
Wow, good
brothers,
job.
all of us. So the experiment worked.
Yeah,
But I think the piece is, it was in the way of being, right? I now understand and see myself. Right? You were talking about how we see ourselves and then how others see us. And when I think I got to a place of, okay, I see myself in aspects of myself as a loving person. And so what would a loving person do at this moment? What would a loving person say at this moment? Like being able to ask myself and allowing that to guide how I interact, I think has been really helpful. And not only, with my coaching clients, with the strangers that I meet, with the family people that I'm close to, but I do have, I think, a very strong commitment to always finding what brings me peace and what expresses love. And it doesn't always sound like love. Like my boyfriend doesn't say I love you that much, and that not my liking. I prefer to hear it more because I'm more
well,
auditory.
make sure he watches this episode.
And I also know that's not something I can impose on someone for the same reasons that 40 plus years of my life we didn't have it. I was not, but that didn't take anything away. If people had judged me at that time for not being a loving person because I didn't say it, I would have been offended, and how shallow and misguided. They don't know me. How would they make that judgment? So I now hold the same level of grace for others. Like, oh, you didn't have that culture, you didn't have that, it's not present for you, that's not a value that you hold to, that you want to be consistent
Yeah,
about. Okay, but I'm the loving person, therefore I express love in this way, and he expresses in his way, and I also have to create space for that.
that's great. Yeah, when you mentioned about having grace and judging, I think of those as almost opposites. Because I don't know that it's helpful to quote unquote judge another. I certainly have, but I don't think it's really useful because there's like this sunk cost, and you're trying to overfit stuff to match that quote unquote judgment. And there are people that you might think are complete jerks that wind up doing the nicest thing that you really need, like, and vice versa. I mean, there's so many variables. You're really lucky if you get a sliver of accuracy at a moment in time, let alone map that out to a whole human lifespan. This is what you will always be. I don't know that that's helpful. Maybe it is, but I think grace is better because, again, going back to the curiosity and the love, and it allows openness to be surprised, openness for experimentation, and openness to grow. That's another thing. Judgment isn't growth, right?
I'm curious, maybe you have a response to this, because I think what you just said could be, we can extrapolate that and think about it in terms of the leaders that we hold to higher esteem, right? To or higher standard in some ways. Um, are we able to have the same level of grace when we don't feel that people are doing things in a way that we like to have it done, right? Or that we feel loved or cared for or safe? And I'm just wondering, how does that, when we talk about it in terms of, leaders of organizations, leaders of countries, leaders of communities, leaders of, right, people who we have either paid or we have hired or we have voted into roles where they now have the responsibility of leading large groups of us. How would grace work in those instances when we're not getting what we think, perceive our needs being met? Thoughts?
That's a really good question, and I do have some thoughts on that. I'll try to keep it on point and concise. I'm trying to like organize. My mind's going a few years in the past, thinking about certain instances. I think mentioning the Hope family and how, and I'm just using that as an example. It applies to my family and every kind of family, or any system, if you will, where certain things got you here, and now it's like you're iterating and then going back to business, like a product 2.0, etc. I think there's something in human development where we needed scapegoats for whatever reason, but I don't see how it helps now, because I see it as almost like nicotine or some kind of substitute for the work that it takes to achieve the desire that we want, if that makes sense.
Nicotine threw me off, but the other part.
Well, you want to relax or something, so you smoke a cigarette, you feel better for 15 seconds, and then you wind up becoming more stressed because you didn't actually do anything to feel better. You just kind of trick the
I
system.
see the sugar
So it's
high or
like
the nicotine.
you always need a new
Got
scapegoat. You can't really use the same scapegoat all the time, for a variety of reasons. But and I mean, you're not doing it's basically a signal that something is off, but you're not doing the work. Like, it's not really one person's fault that the entire like civilization or country or whatever is falling apart, is, and we know that. But it's like, it feels so good to just be like, if we got that idiot out of whatever, everything would be perfect. And we know that's not true, but it feels good to say, and we do that on all within families, within offices, within governments, etc. And then there's another instance where I saw something that triggered me with someone's behavior. At the time, it triggered me, and I was like, it triggered, I guess, anger. It's like, oh, that's unfair, that's inaccurate, etc. And then I realized, more admittedly recently, that it's actually honesty, because this person was actually only responding to the data that they were picking up in nature, in the environment. And that's actually the other people involved, other people present, have a responsibility to not be people pleasing, to speak their mind, to put their data from their node of the network on the table so that we can run accurate experiments. But we're in a situation where people are hiding their true thoughts and feelings for whatever reason. So we're running experimentations on bad data or incomplete data. And then we blame it all on the scapegoat.
Yeah.
So it's like, this politician, this CEO, this family member, this whatever the person is in your life that you think the world would be better if you just swapped them out for another model. Maybe we should try to experiment with getting more clean data. And maybe, like you mentioned, in your going back to your family, where you're telling your brother, we never said this. I want to start, being honest with you. This upset me. I love you. Being more honest with your emotions, and it sounds like um, that's helped your family. And so I think that might help the other networks, such as businesses or governments. What do you think?
Yeah. I agree. In fact, it reminded me yesterday. I had a call. I'm the board at my church. It's a very small church, but we had a call with I'm the vice president, and it was the president and the former president. And we're just ideating a few things. And at one point in the and we'd had a similar conversation in the past. I had had that conversation individually with both of them. But I remember at one point in the conversation, I was starting to find myself getting this like just irritated. I'm like, are we still talking about this? And oh my goodness, why? If this could have been handled a long time ago, if we'd done something about it, we wouldn't have talked about it. We wouldn't have to be talking about it right now. Like I had all these thoughts, and eventually I was just like, all right, how do I say these thoughts without without the scapegoating, right? Without trying to find blaming or judging anybody, taking responsibility for how I feel, but also just like letting the air out, so to speak, rather than building this tension. And so at one point I was like, all right, y'all, I'm sorry, but I just got to say I'm irritated. I'm irritated right now because I'm irritated because we've had this conversation to a certain extent. We haven't really done anything about it. Now it's coming up again. Da, da, da. And and I said it's not. I, I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember what I said in the moment, but I was very conscious of saying I know that this is not because of anyone's fault, but is I know I pointed at some of the things that I done or hadn't done to actually take responsibility and move the ball forward in any meaningful way and da da da. But it a shifted for me the conversation to a once I just kind of okay, that's the part that I was kind of withholding that I just needed to say. And they could also, we kind of made some light of it too, but now they could see a path. We could all see a path forward to how to actually put some stake in the ground around this and move the needle. I'm doing all these all these idioms, right?
It's okay. I'm following you.
So really like start to do things, do something about it to a long-term fix rather than the short-term stuff. But it was the most loving thing I thought I could do for myself and for the team in that moment, is to just be honest, be truthful and honest about what I was feeling in the moment. And then we could create from there. Because until that was kind of like incomplete data that you're talking about, right? People kind of hoarding whatever information they had or the emotions. And then, maybe we come up with an idea, but I'm like, I secretly don't want to do it because I didn't really feel like I was heard or whatever. I do now see that it's crucial is what a practice and the muscle to hone for me and for others I think that I work with is the ability to be honest, truthful, responsible, and loving all at the same time. And it's clumsy at first, especially if we're not used to it. And I would say that the relationship that we have with the people with whom we're hoping to have that encounter or dynamic is important, that is built on trust, because these are two people who I absolutely trust and have worked side by side with, and I feel are committed to all the things that are good for the organization. And I realized that if we didn't have that foundation of trust with one another, being truthful would have cost me or would have hurt or would have been maybe unacceptable or whatever, right? I don't think it would have added to the relationship.
Or just burned more energy as you're trying to hide parts of yourself and your thoughts and stuff.
Yes. Yes. So that may not have answered or addressed what you asked me, but that was what came through.
It did, yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I mean, very recently I've had a similar kind of thought mapping to my relationships and business dealings, etc. And it's like, the old marketing thing: if you market to everyone, you market to no one. So you might as well start to be honest with yourself. And you actually, once again, going back to that paradox, you discover yourself in others, and you need, I think, to be to a certain degree vulnerable and open to help discern or discover, like I mentioned before, like you might judge someone as a jerk and you're open and they're like, they actually give you this massive epiphany and they're actually one of your staunchest supporters or whatever. I mean, you never know. And that's part of the fun and the discovery, the adventure. And because if you're on the path of, I think, love and honesty, um, the world's pretty interesting. I'd like to finish with public speaking, because a lot of what we talked about, I think you have to really have dialed in when you're speaking on stage. I don't know, maybe you could be like a brilliant actor and be really insecure up there, but I would imagine, like, it's going to be super stressful if you're not somewhat comfortable in your own skin. Could you walk us through what it's like doing like a TEDx like you did?
What it's like in which aspect?
Well, like, it's a good question, actually. So, first of all, what is it like just being on stage at a TEDx event? Is there a certain weight on your shoulders that this is a brand and an institution almost that we all know, and so you have a certain responsibility to deliver? Was there nervousness at being in front of that many like eyes? And could you just talk us through like what your emotions were like stepping on stage?
So first of all, the TEDx is their locally organized event, right? So it's not the TED stage that we all see, right? That's sponsored in somewhere in California, I believe, right, in the Bay Area or something. But it's this particular one took place in Florida, and it wasn't that large an audience. It was a large venue, but it wasn't that large an audience. I couldn't tell you how many, but my mom, my cousins, and my aunt were there for that. So I felt supported. I needed to bring my crew, so that was helpful. Um,
Yeah.
I knew that whatever I shared, and the reason I even did it was because I was at the time taking a storytelling workshop, and the facilitator of that workshop, after hearing me deliver my story, said, "Oh my gosh, you need to do a TED Talk. Let me connect you to someone." Right. So it was nice to have that level of affirmation, validation that I may have something to share. And so going back to the experience, I think I had to really find a message that kind of connected with me that would also be helpful for the audience. So it became more of a storytelling lesson, if you will, where I shared over a period of time in my life, kind of some stories and vignettes of things that had happened. And here's what I learned from it. That was kind of the end of it. So the hardest part, I would say, was finding and landing on a message that I thought would be in alignment with everything. I kind of like what you're saying, right? You don't want to act the part. There's all sorts of really lovely, fascinating, thought-provoking TED Talks, TEDx talks out there, and I didn't want to just
Right.
put something on because of what I'd seen on TED before. But I thought I needed to find something that was authentic to me, that something I could talk about, I could feel really confident with, and that would be meaningful to other people. So part of it was just kind of exploring that. And I questioned it too, because I'm like, do I really want to tell a story? Should I go in with like bullet points? Should I use a slide? Should I, like, nope.
Yeah.
So once I kind of got through the jungle of my insecurities about what to present, I landed on this. And then part of it was also bringing some color to it with family, some stories, some story about my background, and the delivery of it, I actually felt quite confident and good because, again, I'm telling something that is mine. Now is a matter of just organizing it in the 17, 18-minute time frame that they give us, and doing it in a way that looks good on camera, right? With facial expressions and body language, etc. I will say, and since we're being honest and vulnerable here, David, what I realized after the fact, I felt good. I was in there, just really, holding the message. I had family in the audience. It was great. Uh, my cousin had taken photos of me while I was delivering the talk, and afterwards we all went to dinner, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that was so great! I was so great!" I was pumped. I loved the experience. I felt good about it. And then he showed me the pictures, and I saw the photographs, and I was like, I hate my outfit. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I put that. I was like, this is not, I didn't look good. And I it was so the dissonance was so great between how I felt going into it, seeing myself full length mirror and everything, picking out the outfit and everything, to what I saw in a photograph, that I was this close to just letting them, hey, can we cancel the video? Can we just not post it? I think I need to do it.
Wow.
Yeah, huge. And I had some really lovely conversations with people who are well meaning and good coaching, and did some of my own subconscious work and stuff. And part of it is I've entered a phase of my life where there's menopause involved, and that changes my shape. It changes the way I look and the way I sometimes I feel about myself too. And so I hadn't quite put that together until I saw myself in that stage, that wow, this is real. The shift and the change has actually taken place. And I wasn't happy,
Yeah.
David. I was not happy. And I really, for I want to say couple months, just twisting and turning in my head. Oh, I don't know if I really want this. I don't know. It would flare up on some occasions, and as I was working through it with people and with myself, eventually got to a point where I was like, okay, so by the time it was released on the big platform, I had already come to terms and to peace with it. And everybody was like, what are you talking about? What's the big deal? Let it go. No one's even paying attention to that. But that was I was not expecting that. So that was the hardest part about my TED experience. Actually, it was after the fact, all the judgment that I had about myself and my appearance.
That's really interesting. That I mean, it's different than what I haven't done a talk like that before, but I anticipated that it would be nervous, like stepping on the stage. For you, it was nervous, almost stepping off stage, and so. But I mean, that does map to a lot of our insecurities about change, aging, etc. And we're all connected, I think. And so, I mean, we're all going to be there eventually if we're not already.
If
And
we're
I
lucky.
saw this interview.
If
Sorry,
we're lucky.
if we're lucky,
Not
yeah.
all of us get
And
to make it to that
um,
point in life. Yeah. I mean, by the
right,
way,
right. It's
if
a
people see my here's my menopause fan right here. I've been using it on
okay.
occasion. So if you see the Beyonce hair every once in a while, it's not because I have a fan. It's because I have this fan.
Yeah, looks nice, looks
Thank
cool.
you. It matches.
Uh, oh yeah, but that's yeah, that's really brave of you, and I think that it's that's what we need each other to kind of show courage and make life and life transitions and growth and friction less scary because it's how we not just survive but thrive, I think.
Take it for granted. I mean, and like the long and short of it, this is a temporary assignment, right? Living
Yeah,
is a temporary assignment. My dad always says the only thing that you have to do, I have to do is die. That's the only thing I have to do. I don't have a choice about that, right? It's part of it's baked into the program. So
yeah,
I'm challenging myself at this stage in my life now. That's now been about a year and a half ago, but I'm finding new layers to like challenge, and going back to what we said in the beginning, the rules. Like, okay, what are the rules now? If I'm physically, literally not the person that I saw myself to be, and if we probably line up pictures every year, and we would all see the same, a progression of shifting and changing how we look and how we dress and all that stuff. But I think
yeah.
now engaging with like, okay, what are the rules that I had about myself, or what are the judgments that I've had about others and about myself too, and challenging that more and more consistently so that I don't feel inhibited by living this temporary assignment that I've been given. Right? Can I just be in this assignment and get the most out of it? Right? When you were in Japan,
Yeah.
how long were you in Japan?
Off and on about a
A
decade.
decade, right? And it was temporary, right? You haven't
Everything's
everything is
temporary.
temporary. But imagine if you hadn't done all the things that you did while you were there, or given people the
It was,
experiences.
it was supposed to be a gap year. I
Many
mean, yeah,
gaps.
it just turned into a gap decade.
But it's lovely. It's lovely that you were able to create that experience for yourself and others. And I think that's our challenge right now. And at least for me, is figuring out what's true now. What can I do with it?
Yeah.
Where can I chip away at some of the stuff that's keeping me behind some sort of, false constraint? And how can I be more loving? How can I be more hopeful? How can I express more joy? All that stuff.
That's great, Valerie. I think we should put a pin in that. We can continue with part two, maybe after you get that book further
Right?
along. Is there anywhere that people can watch like some of your stuff, or would you like to guide people?
Sure. I think my website is probably the one place where everything is, you can find everything. So valeriehope.com. And if you would put that in the show notes, I think it would be sufficient. But I have a YouTube channel, and my podcasts can be found on any of the major platforms as well.
It's been a real pleasure chatting with you today, and I look forward to our next conversation. Thanks, Valerie.
Same here, David. Thank you so much for honoring this time. And I do love you, right? It's in keeping with everything that we said. I love our
Well,
conversation, and
thank
I
you.
appreciate the love that
I
you've
love you
extended
too.
too.